The right-wing Reform UK party, led by Nigel Farage, has been riding high in English opinion polls for months. But could they now break through into Scotland's very different political scene? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, Scottish politics has been dominated by the pro-independence SNP for decades, with the main British parties forming a fractured opposition. But now the growth of Nigel Farage's right-wing Reform UK, which is already topping every poll south of the border, is making inroads in Scotland too.
He's the British politician with the most to smile about. Nigel Farage's Reform Party has been topping opinion polls for the past 7 months. But that's for the UK Parliament, overwhelmingly made up of English seats. Now Reform UK is surging in Scotland to become its second most popular party.
As we head towards those massive elections in Wales, in Scotland, in London, in the Midlands and elsewhere next year, is that you are the People's Army.
Scotland, which is part of the UK, has its own parliament, own elections, and its own policies. It's been run by the pro-independent, anti-Brexit and left-wing Scottish National Party for close to 20 years. But with Nigel Farage's reform, the political landscape is changing.
Inevitably, the charisma of Nigel Farage does wash north of the border. We saw that in the Hamilton by-election. But it simply isn't going to float as many boats north of the border because there is a less ready audience for the relatively socially conservative pro-Brexit message.
The SNP, led by First Minister John Swinney, is taking reform's rise seriously and already thinking about how to play it politically.
I think the rise of reform is once again, for me, another reason why people should be looking to Scottish independence. Because it is likely, by every poll that comes out, that Nigel Farage could well be the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Does Scotland really want a man who doesn't even believe in the Scottish Parliament or the establishment of the Scottish Parliament, therefore Scottish self-determination or home rule? Do they really want that man to making decisions for them when he has the keys to number 10?
As Keir Starmer's deeply unpopular government hits the Labour Party's standing in Scotland and Wales, will Nigel Farage's Reform Party make serious gains in Scotland's upcoming election in 6 months' time? And what is the appeal for Scottish voters?
Well, before we meet our panellists, let's go first to West Lothian in Scotland and speak to Neil Findlay. Neil is a former member of the Scottish Parliament for the Labour Party. Neil, give us your assessment of what's going on here. Is reform really that popular in Scotland now?
Well, I think what is happening is that there is a major protest vote coming out in Scotland. All of the major parties standing in the election have been in government, whether that be at a UK level, a Scottish level or a local government level over the last 2 decades. They've all been in government at some level. And they have been collectively responsible for the state of Scottish politics at the moment, which is a pretty grim state. And people are looking for a protest against those parties. And reform is gaining from that. And I think that's a pretty worrying and desperate situation.
What does it mean for big parties like Labour then and the SNP?
Well, the SNP over the last 20 years has benefited from, in some ways, that protest vote. They presented themselves as being the kind of insurgents against the sort of Westminster orthodoxy, and they've gained from that. But if you look at how Scotland is governed, whether that be at a Scottish government level or a UK level, we have both governments performing really, really badly. I mean, we have 1 in 6 Scots on NHS waiting lists. We have a social care crisis. We have the worst drug deaths in the whole of Europe. We have endemic low pay and poverty. We have 1 million Scots who are food insecure. Now, that is a damning indictment of the way the country is being governed at the moment. And therefore, when a party comes along that offers an alternative, offers a protest, then I think Reform are gaining from that.
Do you think this is a flash in the pan, all this kind of polling for Reform riding high, or do you think they're in Scotland for the long game?
Well, the Scottish electoral system helps them. We have a proportional system, and it is likely, the way in which they are polling, that they will get representation in the Scottish Parliament elections. Now, with representation comes the ability to start organising, to start getting your message across in a much more effective way. And, that's a basis from which they can advance. But it's really incumbent upon the other parties to come forward with a political agenda that starts to address the major issues, the massive issues affecting Scottish people.
Well, let's bring in the rest of our panellists. I'm delighted to say here with me in the studio we have Scarlett Maguire. Scarlett is founding director of the polling company Merlin Strategy. We also have Kevin Schofield. Kevin is political editor at the HuffPost UK. And broadcaster Clare Muldoon is with me also in the studio. And joining us from Liverpool, we have Jon Tonge. Jon is Professor of Politics at the University of Liverpool. You're all very welcome to this roundtable. Clare, to you first. The problem I have with this story is Reform UK is predominantly an English nationalist party, correct?
Yes.
Why are so many Scottish people suddenly supporting Reform?
Well, do you know what? I think we have to take it back and look at Wales and what happened there in the by-election in Caerphilly, actually. And a lot of the Welsh people, correct me if I'm wrong, Scarlett, as a pollster, actually identify very strongly with their Welsh identity. And in Caerphilly is even more so. But that was this by-election. In 2024, the results were separate from that. They were different from that. More people actually identified with Wales being part of the Union than being Welsh themselves. So what changed then in that 2024 to 2025 now? And I think it is down to pure and utter nationalism. And I think that's going to be the cross that Scotland will have to bear going forward to the next election when they have one. And I think Reform are currently number 2 in the polls at the moment in Scotland. But why on earth are people still logging on to the SNP despite the horrendous education policy, capital of drugs, deaths in Europe, Humza useless, Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond dying penniless because of the infighting, and now John Swinney, who's not worth anything in my view as well. And I think we have to look back to Wales, as I said, and I think it's national identity.
Thanks, Clare. Kevin, do you agree with that?
I mean, I think Clare is right to highlight SNP's poor track record in office. There's no doubt. You mentioned drug deaths, capital of Europe, terrible. They've been in power since 2007. NHS, not great. School standards, not great. And I think that is probably fed into why people are now looking at Reform in Scotland. It's not so much an English nationalism thing, or it's more an anti-SNP thing and an anti-Labour, anti-establishment politics. So we see it in England or in the rest of the UK where people are fed up with Labour already. Not that they were ever greatly in love with them to begin with, I don't think. Definitely fed up with the Tories and are looking for an alternative. And Reform are a shiny new thing. And that is certainly the case in the rest of the UK, but in Scotland as well now. And it is, you're right, it's paradoxical. This is a party which Nigel Farage would identify as an English nationalist. And yet it's more, I think, in Scotland, an anti-politics vote, and they're hoovering that up right now.
Scarlett, I can see you nodding.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I think that's exactly why Reform are riding so high relative to how Nigel Farage has previously performed in Scotland in the polls. Claire's absolutely right. They're currently polling second in Scotland. They've had a very strong performance. They came third, actually, but in the Holyrood by-election that we had earlier this year, they got around 26%. That is so much better than Nigel Farage has ever managed to do in Scotland before. I mean, if you go back to UKIP days, they were struggled to even get a single percent at these sorts of elections. So it really, really was, for Reform, quite an astonishing performance. But Kevin's absolutely right. I think that's not because there are voters in Scotland that look at them and think, I want to vote for an English nationalist. The voters that they're getting are actually quite varied. They've moved away from just their sort of very older, male audience that they used to get. And now there's almost no gender divide when it comes to the people that are voting for them in Scotland. They do tend to be over 45. They do tend to be lower earners and people who don't have degrees, for example. So there are still demographics which Reform aren't reaching, but they are managing to have a much broader appeal than they have done.
Let's bring in Jon Tonge. Jon, give us your reading of it. There seems to be a real disillusionment with the main traditional parties in Scotland. Is that your assessment?
Look, there's a section of the Scottish electorate that would sooner support the English soccer team than they would back a Nigel Farage-led Reform Party. Those people will predominantly vote for either the SNP or for Labour. But there is a section of the Scottish population that will entertain reform. 7% of the vote at the last Westminster election was a decent start. 25% of the vote in the Hamilton by-election was a very good performance by Reform. And I don't think we can simply dismiss it as English nationalist because, frankly, Reform's percentage vote at the last Westminster election in Wales matched its performance in England. Reform got 36% of the vote in the recent Caerphilly by-election. And remember that Wales, not just England, voted for Brexit as well. So to simply say that Reform will only ever attract a significant vote in England is simply wrong. It is more difficult for Reform in Scotland because you've got that SNP versus Labour and to some extent the Conservatives battle, for sure. But there is a section of the Scottish population that will entertain a party that is too often simply dismissed as English nationalist.
Thanks, Jon. Kevin, to you, let's talk about migration in Scotland. How big an issue is it for the average person?
It is an issue. It's possibly not as big an issue as in England, but it is still an issue. The Scots and the SNP in particular like to present themselves quite often as, refugees are welcome here. We're much more open-minded when it comes to immigration than the English. That's the impression, certainly, that the SNP want to present to the world. But it's not the whole story. We've seen in the part of Scotland where I come from, there were protests outside an asylum hotel, just as there have been in Scotland. In fact, in England. On a recent visit home, I noticed for the first time the saltire flags being flown from lampposts in the same way that St George's Cross flags are flown from lampposts in parts of England. And that really struck me because now it's the right, Reform supporters are trying to reclaim the saltire from the SNP. It's more of a sort of anti-immigrant symbol as they would present it. So it is a factor. It's maybe not as big a factor as it is in England. Clearly, the small boats are on the south coast of England, 400, 500 miles away from Scotland, so it's less of a resonant issue. But it is still an issue. Immigration has increased in Scotland, and that with it, unfortunately, in my opinion, has brought more anti-immigrant sentiment. But so it is also, I think, a part of the explanation as to why Reform are doing better.
Just on that point, Kevin, the former First Minister of Scotland, Humza Yousaf, was in Istanbul last week and he spoke to TRT World about the issue of Reform doing so well in Scotland. Just take a listen to this.
To me, Reform is a party that has exposed itself time and time again as being anti-Muslim. And therefore, I'm afraid there is a responsibility on those who are progressively minded like me and my party to make sure we are the alternative to that very dystopian vision that is presented by Reform.
Scarlett, your reaction to what Humza Yousaf had to say there?
I think it's very interesting. We've actually seen Keir Starmer pivot to start using quite similar language to Humza Yousaf when he starts talking about Reform, or at least certainly part of Reform's policy platform. We had that around Labour conference, and we had this plea to be, behind the forces of optimism rather than division and national decline. And I think it's interesting because on the one hand, there are definitely parts of the electorate that will appeal to. Some people will feel that he has a moral obligation to call out what he sees to be those sorts of dark forces. But on the other hand, I think it can be I actually think it can be quite a risky strategy. If you look at the sort of 1 in 5 Scots who currently say they're going to vote Reform, it can be quite easy for those sorts of messages to sound like attacks on the voters rather than the politicians, even if that's not at all how they're meant. And that can quite often backfire and then fuel the support for these parties.
Claire, just come in on this. Yeah. Should migrant communities in Scotland be worried about Reform getting into any sort of power?
No, they shouldn't, because I don't think that Reform actually wears that badge at all. I mean, the ex-party chairman of Reform, one of the biggest donors, is a Sri Lankan-born Muslim, for heaven's sake.
But
It's
at
happening
street
in
level,
Scotland.
we're hearing that Muslim communities across the UK, when Nigel Farage is on TV saying certain things, it filters down to street level and people get abuse.
Well, people shouldn't get abused. And as Scarlett previously said, the demographic has changed a lot in the Reform membership. And I think you'll find that is happening more in Scotland than it actually is in England.
I would also point out, though, that in the recent Hamilton by-election in Scotland, Reform ran, part of their campaign, they ran adverts questioning Anas Sarwar, the Scottish Labour leader, his loyalty to Scotland.
Yes.
They suggested...
Just tell me his religion, Anas Sarwar.
He's Muslim. And they suggested that his loyalty was to the Pakistani community, which was rejected, I think, rightly, as racist. So they're not above employing those types of tactics when they think it might...
John, let's talk about the Scottish economy and the SNP track record over 18 years in power. I read a poll this week. Only 20% of Scots think the SNP are handling the Scottish economy well. I mean, the economy will surely play into any right-minded person's voting preference.
Well, the economy ought to be a far more important issue because, let's face it, immigration is not a devolved matter for Scotland. So all the furore about Reform's strongly anti-immigration policies, in one sense, it doesn't matter because until Scotland has full control over its immigration policy, it's something of a red herring. And just to revert to that point on sectarianism, and Scotland's hardly historically a stranger to sectarianism, albeit of the Protestant Catholic variety. I do think there's an element within Reform that wants to go down the anti-Muslim, anti-Islam route, but it's to some extent been reined in by the party leadership. But you've had the Reform MP Sarah Pochin asking whether the burqa can be banned. In terms of the Scottish economy, I mean, the SNP, one of the great electoral success stories of the SNP is how it's managed to continually be re-elected in Scotland, despite an economy that often underperforms. And that, I think, highlights the division within Scottish politics. You've got 3 unionist parties, now 4 unionist parties with Reform, with a unionist vote therefore split, 4 ways, whereas the Scottish National Party, as the party of Scottish independence, has a monopoly of that independence vote. That's been the secret to the SNP continually being re-elected, not a strong performance from the Scottish economy under an SNP government by any means.
Scarlett, just talk to me about Scottish independence then, because it hasn't gone away.
No.
There's still significant support. And no matter what Nigel Farage does, the SNP will still beat Reform next year.
Yeah, I think the SNP, I would be very surprised if Reform, I wouldn't rule it out, but I would be surprised if Reform were to beat the SNP in next year's Holyrood elections. But I think what John was just saying there is very interesting because, yes, Reform's base is disproportionately unionist, but not exclusively so. About 1 in 5 of Reform's current voters in Scotland actually would back independence. And so they're at the moment, they're walking this line. I think they probably don't want the next election to be on the issue of independence because that means they can continue appealing to both unionists while they then try and gain their traction with those independent voters, because I can think they can see there's a space there for voters that want independence, but for many of the reasons that have already been raised are fed up with the SNP. But if they're forced to be too strong on the issue, that obviously might alienate some people.
Kevin, one name we haven't mentioned so far is Keir Starmer. We know Anas Sarwar is Labour leader in Scotland, but nationally in the UK, it's Keir Starmer as British Prime Minister and Labour leader overall. How's he viewed by most Scots?
Not very well. You speak to Labour politicians in Scotland, you speak to Conservative politicians, you go out on the doors every weekend, and one, albeit a Conservative, said to me that Keir Starmer is as popular as Margaret Thatcher was in Scotland. And for viewers who might not know, she was not popular at all. So that is, an incredible thing to say for a Labour leader. So I think it's safe to say, come the Holyrood election campaign next year, Keir Starmer will have to come to Scotland to campaign, but Anas Sarwar certainly won't be desperate for him to come.
Yeah, Claire, just come in on Starmer.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Starmer has done more harm, I think, than anything, than even Rachel Reeves, Rachel from Accounts, as we like to call her. But I think one of the issues here that we've not spoken about is that of devolution. And Wales has not got as much devolution powers as Scotland has. And of course, that was brought in with Tony Blair. England isn't a devolved parliament. England still serves both everywhere, in Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and indeed England. And if we were to get rid of devolution, if we were to get rid of all the quangos, I think we'd actually be in a much better position going forward. And I think Starmer, if he knew at all what he was doing, which he doesn't, if he had people around him that could advise him in the best possible routes for everything, then it would be a lot better. I think we need disruptors like Reform to come in and just throw the game up on its head and actually then catch the pieces. And if everyone were just to sit round, a new round table, Enda, why don't you invite them all round and let's get the world sorted?
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Back to you, Jon. Jon, just come in on Starmer in Scotland and Jon saying that he is matching Margaret Thatcher for levels of unpopularity. That really is some achievement.
Yeah, that's absolutely extraordinary. I mean, for a while, Labour revived in Scotland after many terrible years under a succession of leaders, most of whom were instantly forgettable. There was a revival briefly under Anna Sawar, and Labour did recapture seats at the general election. But frankly, Labour's prospects look abysmal for the Scottish Parliament elections next May, not far away at all. And really, I think it will be a contest in many ways between the Scottish National Party and Reform. The Conservatives are in abeyance in Scotland after, again, a brief revival. So there's plenty of fertile territory for a party like Reform to occupy because there is that disenchantment. And yes, I don't think Starmer can do much at all about that. I mean, Starmer would just be seen as a London lawyer, a North London lawyer in Scotland, with no particular knowledge of Scotland, no particular love for the country.
Scarlett, just come in on Nigel Farage then. This is a guy that Starmer has referred to as a snake oil merchant. How do you think he plays with the Scottish public?
Well, I think what you can see from not just the Scottish public, but quite a lot of his supporters north and south of the border, is that it's a bit of a mixed bag, actually. So even amongst those who say they're going to vote for Reform, you might hear some good things about him, being like he's a conviction politician. He says what he's always said what he means now, thinking about things like immigration, thinking about other people moving and him keeping the same position. However, there's a lot of caveats. And again, even amongst Reform voters, there's lots of caveats that you see, including things like, well, he's good on immigration, but not sure what else he can do, not sure that he's got the policies, not sure that he's got the right team, think he might be a bit of a one-man band. And actually, even though I think a lot of people would still vote for Reform out of a protest vote, there is uncertainty around his leadership, even though they still think he's better than the other ones.
Kevin, do you think realistically then next year Reform could be the opposition in Scotland? Because the SNP are not going to lose. They're just too strong.
They're not.
But how much of a problem does that then cause Starmer internally in the Labour Party if his people see seats slipping away in a traditional power base like Scotland and Starmer's losing to Farage in Scotland? Does that then create problems in Westminster?
Huge problems. I mean, I think there is a very good chance that Reform, Jon touched on it there, because of the way that the unionist vote is split, they could well become the largest unionist party, which would make them then probably the largest opposition party in the Scottish Parliament. I think that would definitely be a problem for Keir Starmer, but it wouldn't be his only problem, because on the same day as those elections, there's the elections to the Welsh Senate, in which Reform is basically a straight fight again between Reform and Plaid Cymru. So Labour are going to lose power there for the first time ever. And English council seats are also up for election that day as well. Great chance that Labour are going to do very badly indeed. So it could be the perfect storm for Keir Starmer. We could see it could be the end of Keir Starmer come May.
Claire, on that point, will it be the end for Starmer? I know you hope it'll be.
I definitely hope it'll be. Gosh, you can read my mind. Give me the lottery numbers, please. I think
7, 18, 21.
You heard them here first.
Yeah.
I think, no, I honestly think that the shift, this is a seismic shift in politics. It's a seismic shift in identity politics. It's a seismic shift in demographics, migration, immigration, politics, economy, everything. And I think that it is the end of Labour.
Jon, we're seeing a real fragmentation across the United Kingdom, aren't we? Do you think that will be the case in Scotland then in 2026?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I'd echo the points that were made. Reform's going to do really, really well in the English local elections, which will be of a different nature from the ones they did well in last year when they were mainly Conservative seats. This time, a lot of those council elections will be in Labour areas, and Reform will prove that it can take a lot of votes from Labour. Reform's going to do well for sure in the Senate elections in Wales. As I say, I think Scotland's tougher for reform. I think the weakness of reform is not its capacity to attract votes. It is, again, this point was mentioned earlier, it is a one-man band. You know, if Nigel Farage was to step down tomorrow, I'd expect reform to disappear the day after. You know, so there's a lot of vulnerability there.
Thanks, Jon. Scarlett, just final point. We've not mentioned the Conservatives. How much of a problem has Farage created for Conservatives north and south of the border in terms of vote share dissipating?
I mean, the fact that we've not mentioned them is their entire problem, really. I mean, that's the problem. They've been written out of political conversation. The voters don't think about them anymore. They don't hear from them. They don't hear anything about them. That includes even people that even stuck with the party at the last election, which was, their worst ever election result they've got. Even those voters are now saying, well, I never hear anything about them. I don't know what their policies are, can barely name the leader. I mean, it's really, really bad. And I think there's a lot of complacency in the Conservative Party after the last election.
You keep across it. Scarlett, Kevin, Claire and Jon, thank you all so much. Fascinating stuff. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.